Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's podcast. And this is an interesting one because it's, again, a topic that straddles both the podcasts that we're running at the moment, whether it's HR Uprising or compliance culture, because we're going to look in on the topic of governance in terms of AI. And as we know, governance is a key issue for HR professionals, but equally in terms of compliance, another aspect. And AI is ubiquitous. We've really got to work out where we are with this. So I'm really delighted that I've got an expert on this topic, Rood, to talk to us today. He's a founder of Perceptual, and Perceptual provides AI governance and compliance implementation consulting as well as training. Hence, we've got hats on for HR and for compliance professionals. So John, would you like to just explain a little bit about your background and how you became expert in this area?
Sure, Lucinda, absolutely. So we've been working on Perceptual for about 3.5 years now. So we started in 2022, which was really just the Wild West in terms of AI governance and regulation. So that was the period well before sort of these like major international regulations, which I know we're going to talk about, like EU AI Act. That was sort of in the process of being written. And what we found was organizations needed a lot of help figuring out what regulations applied to them. Even past sort of the regulatory world, organizations were trying to figure out what are their customers going to be looking for in terms of AI compliance, AI ethics, and AI governance down the road. So that's how we got into doing the work that we do. Originally, we had done a lot of AI audit work, which was required by a couple of the early regulations. Now, most of our business is in the world of AI governance. So we help organizations understand what are the rules that apply to them, what are the frameworks that get them to compliance, both with regulations and with the demands that their customers are going to put on them for safety and compliance, and then help organizations put those systems into place.
I mean, so you really were ahead of the curve then 3 years ago, because I think some of the things that you've been ensconced in for 3 years plus, it feels to me like really 2025 for a lot of the people that I work with has been the first time that people are really feeling the impact of AI. So it may well be that we need to go back to basics here in terms of our HR professionals and if you're in compliance. And I suppose with that in mind, what should we be aware of and why should we be alert? And does it definitely sit? Well, where does it sit, AI governance? Who should be responsible?
So that's an amazing question. I love that question, and the answer is it's a responsibility that goes throughout the organization. There's a couple places where it ends up sort of like landing, and one of the places is in the HR world, because every regulation around the world of AI will have something to do with the idea of AI bias or AI discrimination. So that's kind of a place where, I think that HR professionals see it. And, HR professionals are not, like, the idea of bias is not new to us, right? So we've been trying to figure out, how do we increase fairness in our hiring process? And that's been an issue for decades all around the world. So that's not new. But now there's just a different kind of spin that we have to be thinking of. The other place that governance often lands is if an organization is large enough to have data security or privacy professionals, oftentimes it'll land on their desk as well. But the real answer to the question is governance ends up having to go throughout the organization. And if we say, governance just belongs only in HR or only in information security or only in IT, it doesn't end up working, right? Because the policies that we create to put governance into place have to filter throughout the entire organization. And if they don't do that, we end up with issues like shadow AI, with issues like no one reporting, malconformities to the processes that we put in place. And that's where we get bias, liability, lack of fairness, lack of transparency, all of the problems.
So I might come back to that shadow AI because I don't know what that term is. So you have to explain that to me in a minute. But I was just starting thinking so where does it sort of impact? So I'm thinking if I'm it doesn't surprise me it sits with HR, because anything that has to become a process, well, HR gets done, most things are done on HR who don't know where to put them. But particularly if you're turning something from a task into a process, they often get to be the custodians of a process, a management process. But I'm also thinking if you're a compliance professional, often that's to do with you are protecting a firm from a regulator. So there's a defined set of standards. Or maybe it's almost like legal, so which again is like a defined set of, like it's the law. So what are you protecting? What are you governing when it comes to AI?
Sure. So in the, to answer the question that you had asked, what we're protecting in terms of compliance is against a number of the emerging regulations. So EU AI Act is kind of the primary one that most folks will be aware of and will be watching. That's very much a developing story. So even in the last 2 weeks, we started to get news out of Brussels that they're considering certain changes to the EU AI Act, which I think that the spin from Brussels will be that it's just kind of keeping up with the times. The reality will be that the pushback on EU AI Act has been so strong that certain provisions are likely to be watered down, which again is that you'll never hear that word from Brussels, but that'll be the effect of it. So that's one of the primary things that from a regulatory standpoint, people will be looking for. But the other big one in terms of compliance is the vast majority of our clients end up coming to us not because they're concerned about regulation, although they are, but because they're trying to sell into a larger organization that's starting to demand AI governance. So the same way that every organization is used to, you go sell into a big company, they come back and say, here's all of the requirements. You've got to have your ISO 27001, for example, for information security.
Or your
now
cyber
AI governance is at
essentials
the
or
top of that
something.
list.
Yeah, so essentially if you're selling to company IT type stuff or cyber essentials or ISO 27000, okay, so it's like
Exactly.
because you want to sell, you want to operate there, you've got to evidence that you're compliant with something.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And the EU AI Act, I don't know anything about this, so therefore I'm going to assume that other people listening don't necessarily. Obviously, because the UK has managed to extricate ourselves from the EU. I don't know. We don't necessarily fall under it, I'm assuming, in the UK, but I assume that we will align with it. You'd think that would make sense as opposed to doing it ourselves. And I assume there's an equivalent in the US, is there? Is it called something different in the US?
So the U.S. is a mess in terms of AI regulation. So there's no effective regulation of AI at the federal level here in the United States, and that's the case both with our current administration and actually with our last administration. So there's state by state regulations that a lot of our clients end up having to work on. That's actually much harder. It's much harder to have 5 different standards than it is to have just one, even though the EU AI Act is probably the most stringent international standard at this moment, I would say.
So give me an example of something that's in the EU AI Act then. And also, if you said, I know they won't use the word watering down, what's the pushback on it? What's the kind of implications in terms of that?
Sure. So I'm not sure what those implications will be. I think that we're just like hearing so many different things that it's when your listeners listen to this in 2 weeks, it might well be different from where it is today. So that's kind of a big I don't know, and we'll see. In terms of who this is going to end up applying to and what companies are actually going to have to do, what we found as we kind of looked back historically on EU regulation was that the EU oftentimes sets a global standard based both on their desire to act quickly on new items like new issues, and the expansiveness with which they're willing to regulate. So the analogy that I always make is to GDPR. where, GDPR, like the audience probably knows more about GDPR specifically than I do, but what I've seen.
Plenty, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So like every website has like the cookie warning now, and everyone knows that they have to have some element of GDPR compliance. And that's whether you're in the EU, in the UK, in the US, like wherever you are, it sets the global standard. So it seems likely that that's what's going to happen in this situation as well.
Oh, so you think basically the EU might lead the way, and then if people signed up to it, which would be a simplicity, I guess, if it's a global standard, and what might that mean practically for an organisation? What might we expect to see coming down the line, do you think?
So the first decision point for an organization is to look at what the EUA Act defines as kind of its like risk-based categorization of the uses of AI. So imagine it kind of like as a pyramid, where at the top there's certain uses of AI which are just banned, right? So things like social scoring, some facial recognition, things like some things are just banned, and I think for good reason. Like I think that those are all pretty reasonable. Then there's this middle tier, which are AI uses that are defined as what they call high risk. So germane for your audience, I think for both of your audiences, one of those areas is anything to do with hiring, promotion, like kind of the human resources function is in there. Finance is also in there, along with things like insurance, things like physical infrastructure creation, and there's like 5 or 6 other categories. So an organization which is using AI in one of those, again, quotes, high risk implementations has to do a lot of work. And I'm happy to kind of talk about that, but it's basically tons of process, tons of paperwork, tons of management systems to be compliant.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe you set my brain thinking about it. And it is interesting that both our HR audience and our compliance audience, a lot of it's really about protecting people, isn't it? So
Correct.
the compliance audience, if they're FCA regulated, there's a lot of pressure on them to sort of protect consumers and treat customers fairly. And you can see how AI, if used unscrupulously, could treat customers unfairly. So you have to make sure that happens. And it's the same in terms of recruiting people. So it is that kind of impact on humans, if not used with great ethics, I suppose. And that probably is, from a professional organisation, people listening here are going to want to use something like this to, yes, be more effective, to use it in a good way and ethically. And I guess, and maybe that's the angle to go down in terms of if an organisation wants to embrace the regulations, make the most out of AI, how they can, plan to use it in an effective and ethical way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. In the world of governance, we always think of terms of risk management, and so risk management is we identify the stakeholders, we identify potential risks, and then we're thinking about the probability of a risk occurring and the impact on people, mostly that would have if it came to pass. So there's a whole category of things that are not defined as high risk, because even if those sorts of risks happen, like it's okay. So things like video AI and like video games, for example, like not that big of a deal if a video game cheats, right? But when there's an impact, exactly as you said, on a real person, that's when there's a substantial risk and a substantial issue.
And I suppose what's tricky there that's gone into my head, and I don't know if there's an answer to this, but I'll ask the question anyway. It's kind of who governs the AI? Because I'm now thinking about what happens when, I don't know, a media organisation, when someone who controls it or has infiltrated it. So if we go back to the original stuff about bias in recruitment, wasn't it? The problem was that if you put in biased data, you get biased data out. So they, that sort of thing. So is there anything that can control that? The sort of the oversight of it? And I think the answer is probably no. I don't know, but that's the scary bit about it.
Yeah, no, it is. And your question of kind of whose responsibility is this is answered by our friends, the regulators, oftentimes as everybody, basically. So for EU AI Act, there are certain obligations that fall on the developers of the AI system, and there's obligations that fall on the deployers or users of the AI system. So one of the calls that we get pretty frequently is, an organization will call us and say, we don't develop AI, but we use AI in the course of, in the HR function, for example, in our HR information system software, in our applicant tracking system, which like everybody does, like literally everybody does those things. What do we need to do to be protected? And so there's certain governance functions that fall just on the people making the system, but the people using the system have their separate set of obligations as well.
And then looping back to your comment, sort of looping back round in terms of there are all these obligations, but it's all a little bit unknown. So it's really weird creating regulations in an unknown space, isn't it? You're kind of, well, I suppose, what's the comeback on these things? Is there something that definitely, do you see these regulations getting if becoming effective, getting properly tied down and actually coming into force for organisations?
We've seen that process has been a total mess, and it's been a mess everywhere. And it's for exactly the reason that you had identified, which is it's regulators that are trying to regulate a thing that is moving so quickly that number one, I'm not sure that there's a deep understanding on the part of every regulator on what they're regulating today, but the other part of it is like, if you think about EU AI Act, Brussels has been writing that for 3 years, right? And so now they're getting to the point where it was actually supposed to be going into effect in 2026. And there's all these doubts now about whether or not that's such a good idea. We've seen this in the US as well. So we saw one of the first regulations of AI was in New York City. We did a lot of work on that law, and a study was done that suggested that 99% of organizations are not compliant with that law. So companies have simply ignored that one, and City of New York has chosen not to really enforce it. So we're seeing all sorts of challenges that are I think a nice way to say it would be growing pains as we all try to figure out what we do with this new technology as a society.
And you can see that something that's evolving so quickly that the legislation is probably out of date by the time they've written it, if you know what I mean. That's the whole thing. That's the problem, isn't it? When people are pushing back on it, you were saying it was too restrictive. What are people not liking about it? The EU AI Act.
Yeah, that's a great question. So from my perspective, as someone who works with kind of like mid-sized organizations pretty frequently on this, it's a couple of things. So number one is that there's not meaningful differentiation based on organization size. So I think if you asked, Brussels as a personified entity, if that's the case, they would say no, because there's like some like special things that they're supposed to develop for small businesses. Functionally, none of that has been done. So the regulations that fall on Microsoft and Google and Siemens, for example, like huge global organizations, are much more similar than they are different than a regulation that falls on a 100-person organization. So that's, I think, one of the big challenges. And a large organization has obviously expertise doing sophisticated compliance work, whereas a small organization has never dealt with something of this complexity before.
Yeah, and they haven't got the resources, time to be able to do it. Yeah, it's got to be proportionate. You can see why that would be challenging. Yeah, so going into, I'm just thinking about things like ISO. It's also not proceduralized or processed, or because things like ISO is 27001 is quite a good example, or Cyber Essentials, any of those where it can be almost as big as the organization applied, or you can apply it in a more of a narrow, proportionate way. But what you're saying is that they haven't got there yet with the AI. I can also imagine that some of the benefits of AI that organisations might have found they wouldn't want to let go of, or they've got used to using, if the restrictions then, if they see it as restricting them from competitive advantage or something in terms of how it works. Again, we don't really know where it's going, do we? I suppose going back to our audience again then, John. So if you were working with one of our customers or one of our audience members, and they just want to put some common sense steps in place, prepare themselves, be ethical, what steps would you suggest that they put in place so that at least they sort of feel that they're readying for things before the regulations come out?
It's a great question. So I think of it as three levels, and this is grossly simplified, but it'll give the audience a good idea of how to think through the problem. I would say kind of like the lowest level of risk are relatively small organizations who are users of AI off the shelf, right? They use Microsoft Copilot and ChatGPT Pro Edition, whatever, like those sorts of things. AI in their HRIS, those things. The very minimum level that every organization to me needs is there has to be an AI use policy, which that really is, in my mind, an HR document. I've been talking about AI use policies now for many years. In 2023, I talked to audiences like this, and no one had ever heard of that before. Now, I ask live audiences, and like 70% of people raise their hands and say that their organization has an AI use policy. So that to me is just the absolute table stakes, because if you don't have control over how people in your organization are using AI, there's whatever else you're doing is not going to work, right? No other governance structure will work. So that's kind of the bottom layer that everyone needs. The next layer up is implementation of what I kind of think of as like a light governance framework. So this could be something like here in the US, we have the National Institute of Standards and Technology has a AI risk management framework. It's a nice framework. It makes sense. It's relatively straightforward, not easy, but straightforward to put into an organization. So there we're kind of putting together the right policies to govern the AI process, and then kind of saying like, well, we did it. Here it is. It's pretty good. The tippy top of the pyramid for large organizations, for developers of AI, for very risk-averse organizations, for example, our finance audience today, is installation of ISO 42001, which is AI governance, and official certification. So that's organizations who are really looking ahead on this, who want to make the investment today to be kind of future-proofed. That's the right solution today.
So sorry, there is an ISO standard for AI. Is it 42001?
42001, yeah.
Oh, okay. So how long's that been out there?
I think it was last year that it was introduced. I got certified as lead auditor on that last year. So I think it was early last year, but someone might correct me that it might have been 2023.
Okay, so that links nicely on then. So those are practical steps for many of our listeners. Just have you got a policy to start with that put these things in place and then aspire to ISO, but at least even knowing it's there. And then in terms of training people and educating people, I know that's part of an arm of what you do as well.
It is.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what you recommend, what training people should have? Because it's all very well trying to govern it, but it's let loose, isn't it? People are using it. So how do we train people?
So the way I think about it is there's kind of three levels that I think of the organization, and at the very top is the executives, the CEO, the board, the people that are making these decisions. And there's an element of training that I think is necessary for that audience around the idea of AI governance specifically, because that's part of some of the regulations and the frameworks that we've been talking about. So for example, in the EU AI Act, there's a section on AI literacy, and it's very specific that the people that are governing AI in the organization have to have the right kind of training to do so. It's very unclear as to what that training should entail. I'm happy to talk about that all day because that's the work that we do. But I think the executive level needs something like that on governance. I think that the folks kind of in the middle of the organization, so the department leaders, the directors, the managers, there's a level of training there as well that's oftentimes more specific to a function. So, here are the challenges that we might have with AI in the world of sales, in the world of finance, marketing, whatever. And then the part that I think that a lot of organizations miss is there has to be a baseline understanding of AI literacy for everyone in the organization, like anyone who's like using a computer at work, which I imagine is like almost everybody now. And those are really basic things like, here are the reasons why we should not take, company assets and upload them to free version of ChatGPT, right? So stuff like that feels basic. But again, if we're not telling people that, we shouldn't expect that they're going to do it the right way.
Yeah, it's almost like the cyber stuff again. So teaching people to not click on links in emails and things like that. It's exactly that kind of level of knowledge, which you shouldn't take for granted, to be honest. It can really get that. So you said that you're an expert at the top level. Just if you're just going to give a high level of somebody, the sort of things that you like to educate at the highest. So I get the middle, I get the bottom level there, and I get the middle level of saying it might be context specific. Just a high level strategic. If you're teaching board members, what sort of things do you focus on there?
So we want to teach a couple things. Number one, we discuss a lot of what we've been talking about today, which is the kind of the risks involved in AI governance. And we're talking about it from three perspectives. One perspective is the regulatory compliance perspective, which obviously is quite important. The second is from the ethical standpoint, right? So here are the actual like challenges with AI. Like here's why there's regulation and how to avoid some of those challenges. And then the third is enabling the organization from a perspective of going out in the market. So we're talking again there about here's what the market is going to expect, here's what it's going to take, and then sometimes we'll do a more in-depth training on actually implementing AI governance standards, which is very technical, difficult work. Sometimes that gets kicked down to again HR, IT, the privacy and infosec department, and sometimes we're doing that in-depth training with those folks instead.
Great. So I guess then in conclusion, John, because I think that it's quite an interesting topic actually, whereas I don't think I would have thought that 9 months ago.
Thank you. Yeah.
But in terms of just sort of wrapping this up, are there any sort of top tips that you'd like to leave with our listeners as to the sort of things that they should be doing or thinking or being aware of with regard to this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So my top thoughts are, number one, again, every organization needs an internal AI use policy. And if you don't have it, that really is, in my mind, like an emergency, basically. Like that's like Q1 of next year is the time to get that done. And then past that, organizations that are doing any sort of business globally really have to start thinking about, instead of like, oh, this regulation or that regulation, ultimately, what all the regulations are pointing towards is a robust system of AI governance that follows either, ISO 42001 or one of the other frameworks. Putting those into effect is a process that, depending on size of the organization and complexity, is like a 4 to 18-month journey. So it's not easy. It's not straightforward. It requires a lot of trade-offs within the organization. So that's work to get started on now. So, if you're listening to this and you're a finance executive, for example, and you think, man, like this is going to be on my radar next year, it should be on your radar this year because now is the time to start planting some of those seeds.
On the, would you say that there are certain industries that need to be ahead of it over others, the 42001?
Yeah, absolutely. So anything that's defined in EU AI Act as high risk, like that's the really simple way to define it. So I'll do the best I can off the top of my head. I'll miss a few. Education, finance, insurance, physical infrastructure, human resources and people management, defense. Oh, and I know I'm missing a couple, so I'll have to go back and study. But there's like 9 or 10, and that's most of them.
So it's where the implications are high, because I think defence are significant if it kind of takes over. Interested in the education one, just a slight segue. I know I was just trying to wrap up, but my daughter graduated last year and my son's at uni at the moment. And it's a minefield for unis in terms of the way, more just I think people using ChatGPT, not being able to use it. How do you tell if it's their own work? That kind of thing. So is that the implication in education, or is there a bigger, more significant one you're talking about?
It's a little different. So what I'm talking about, so I talk to education audiences with some regularity, and we talk about both of those sides. So one side is how do students use the technology, which I think is very interesting. But the other side of it is, again, kind of from like a fairness perspective. It's things that have to do with like admissions or grading or who graduates. So, a simple example, very similar to the world of HR, which, the audience will be familiar with. On the admissions side, if we're using AI to rank resume or to rank applications, that's an area that's kind of ripe for bias. It has real significant impacts on the lives of actual human beings. So that's going to be highly regulated.
So it's like the HR piece again. And again, going back to our finance, it kind of takes us full circle again. It's the potential risk to individuals to over benefit some and disadvantage the disadvantaged type thing almost. Correct. Yeah, it exacerbates it. Thank you so much. I think that's a really interesting insight, John. And obviously, if our listeners want to know more, they can get in touch with you. I'll put your details in the show notes. I see you've got a free AI literacy certification for leaders that we'll put on the link. What is that?
That'd be great.
What is it that they do there then? Is it a questionnaire or is it training? How does that work?
So that's about a 90-minute training that we put together, and it's a step up from what I think everyone in the organization needs, but it's a kind of an outline of here are the high-level risks that are associated with AI. Here are some kind of the global frameworks that are being used to solve some of those challenges, and then here are what leaders should do. And there's a little certification exam at the end, which I think is a great start in getting executives kind of trained up on these issues.
And you're providing that for free?
That one's for free, yep.
Amazing. Okay. And obviously they can then find out what else they do if they do it. So so listeners, go to the show notes in this and there'll be a link to that. And also obviously a link to your webpage, John. And if people want to get hold of you on LinkedIn, how is it John Rood? Is there other ways you'd like them to get hold of you? How can they do that?
Website is great. And then I'm on LinkedIn for sure. So shoot me a message on LinkedIn or fill out the form on our website and we'll be in touch.
And that's Perceptual, the website.
Yep, perceptual.com.
Perceptual.com, PROCEPTUAL.com. Fabulous. Nice. John, thank you so much for allowing me to ask lots of basic questions about actually a very interesting topic and making it engaging. Really appreciate you joining me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for the time.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.
This episode was brought to you by Disruptive Media, helping bold entrepreneurs stand out through podcasting, video, and social content. Visit disruptivemedia.co.uk to learn more.